Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. Today's episode is actually going to be a sports episode. We're going to talk to writer and activist Dave Zirin, who heavily focuses on the intersection of sports and politics. And at least in my organizing circles, being an obsessive sports fan has always been something kind of hidden. My obsession is it's so much that I actually wasn't even sure what to do. I was thinking about what to say for this brief intro. I had about 1 million stories. I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk about when I saw Mark Lamont Hill at an academic conference, and instead of asking him anything about the mountain of work he's done, I wanted to ask him about the Sixers playoffs, or how actually my first academic project ever was about neocolonialism and baseball training camps in the Dominican Republic. And there are about 15 examples that I went through. And I wondered why that was. In some ways, I think sports is an entry point to connect with people, to discuss, to share ideas. It's also a place to engage in deep critique. And I also think that there's something about sports being a place to imagine other possibilities, which is something that Dave and I discuss in the episode. In short, a lot of what political education is about is what sports are about. Of course, they're also hyper-capitalist products and incredibly problematic in so many ways. But like education, sports is a site of struggle. Dave Zirin, welcome to Another Education is Possible. How are you doing?
Hey, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
I think there are going to be some interlocking threads here of Judaism, Zionism, and politics and sports all kind of coming together and being pulled apart. So what did all of that look like for you growing up?
Well, honestly, there were a lot of interlocking issues. I grew up in New York City. My dad grew up a big Brooklyn Dodgers fan. So in addition to revering the Brooklyn Dodgers, even though they disappeared decades before I was born, I was somebody who grew up loving Jackie Robinson and also loving Sandy Koufax, who I would be able to tell you his brief Brooklyn statistics before moving out to Los Angeles. So seeing the Brooklyn Dodgers as being rooted in both a kind of openness to Jewish athletic greatness, which it felt like a lot of these teams weren't open to, and also feeling a little bit like a young Jewish athlete myself whose potential was the world. I was very wrong. I related to that. And then also just the incredible, virtue. And I know that this was just a young boy's way of seeing it, and that the real story was much more complicated. But the virtue of being the fan of the team and being from the city that held Jackie Robinson close to us, that cheered for Jackie Robinson, that defended Jackie Robinson, that would go on to cheer and defend people like Roy Campanella. This was something that, my dad imbued me with a lot of pride about. So I took that part of it very seriously. Like, being Jewish also meant being an advocate for the Black athlete. And it meant that we had our own tradition as well that we should be very proud of when the broader society has a different idea about Jewish athletes. There's the famous, hilarious line from Airplane where the person says, "I'd like some light reading," and the flight attendant says, "Well, I have a pamphlet about great Jewish athletes." It's very, very funny. Felt good growing up in New York City to both feel like, yeah, my people are on the side of the Black athlete. In other words, Brooklyn people. And my people are on the side of the Jewish athlete because I am one, and we know the real history because of people like Sandy Koufax. So that's one aspect of it, if you're talking about Jews and sports and the like. As far as religion and Zionism, and then I'll kick it back to you. I don't want to filibuster too long here. My parents divorced when I was 3 years old. So two very distinct ideas about Judaism coming to me growing up. Both my parents are Jewish. My mom, who I was primarily raised by, and her temple was our primary temple. was very much of the type of, us walking there to temple is a short walk from our house, and her telling us, you don't have to believe in God if you don't want to. And, I'm kind of an existentialist myself. And we would have to be like, what the hell does that mean? And she would say, like, I love temple because of the children's choir and the sense of community. Like, that's kind of what she imbued Judaism for us to be like. My dad was much more like, no, we're going to go to a conservative temple when I've got you. And I'm also going to talk to you a lot about Israel. See, Israel never entered the conversation with my mother when we would talk about Judaism. If anything, I think you would call my mom growing up a non-Zionist as opposed to an anti-Zionist. And I think today it's very popular to say in the movement, like, it's not enough to be a non-Zionist. Like, you actually have to be an anti-Zionist if you're going to oppose the predations of Netanyahu and everything he's doing and has done. But for that time in New York City, being raised by a non-Zionist was a very different kind of way to look at the religion compared to a lot of my friends, certainly. And even a lot of people at the Reform Temple where we went. Like, I remember when at Hebrew school, we would raise money to plant trees in Israel. That was a big thing that we did. So it was part of the Hebrew school dynamic for sure, but not part of the way my mom raised me to think about Judaism dynamic. My dad was quite different. So I was raised with these very differing ideas, but it was also complicated because it's not like I was raised with an argument that said, wait a minute, well, this is why Zionism is colonial. This is why it's immoral. This is why we shouldn't be for any ethno-states at all. There's a word about humanism and how people can most healthily live in this world together. I never got that argument at all. Just, you got Zionism to protect the Jews, and then on the other side, sort of this assumption of sort of, what do we need protection from? I'm in New York City, for God's sakes. The mayor's Ed Koch. That seems a little weird. So I know, again, a very young person's view of everything, because you didn't get more Jewish than Ed Koch. So it's like, wow, we're in the driver's seat. What's the big deal? It really wasn't until I started thinking about politics much more deeply, going in like late high school and then early college, of really starting to think about the contradictions of my own belief system of, okay, I'm an anti-racist. Why do I think Israel's okay? Okay, I have my best friend is Iranian. If somebody kicked his ass on the street for being Iranian, I would be up in arms, ready to kill somebody for him. But gee, here I am thinking that the oppression of Palestinians is, at the time I probably would have said, yeah, it's a necessary evil. The Jews got to have their place too. I wouldn't have thought about it deeply. I would have just been like, yeah, Jews, I probably also would have said something like, I think I even did say this my senior year of high school or something like that. Like, the Gulf War is wrong because you're killing innocent Iraqis and people from Kuwait and Kurds. They're being used as bargaining chips and pawns. It's too many families dying. And then if someone had said to me, yeah, what about Israel-Palestine? I would have been like, well, that's different because that's about protecting Jews. And it really took working through the contradictions of my own belief system. And I started to read a lot. I read Chomsky, Fateful Triangle was a big one, and a lot of other books as well. I really did a deep dive in it. And I finally came to the conclusion, I read all sides too, finally came to the conclusion that I needed to make a choice. And either I believed in an unequal metric of who's oppressed and who isn't and what's justified and what isn't, or I could be consistent and be against all oppression and be against all imperialism. And I chose the latter.
And so that's happening in college when
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
that's when I really did the deep dive. I had a class called Radical Islam, which I signed up for because I thought I'd learn more about Malcolm X. And it was entirely about the growth of quote unquote radical Islam in the Middle East. And it was taught by a former IDF member who actually, in retrospect, was very open in that I would raise with her my disagreements and she suggested things from all sides for me to read. So actually I got much respect for her with that, even though it brought me down a road that she would have been, I think, quite at odds with.
I want to take a step back here, but I'd be interested if just analyzing that, thinking if those recommendations were a feeling of, well, this is a Jew, there's complete safety here. You can look outside and we're not worried that you'll, actually take this to heart. You'll just use it to entrench your Zionism. But thinking back
Well,
to,
no, because it was interesting. Is like it was both sides. Like I also was speaking to hardcore anti-Zionist Jews, trying to get me to read stuff too. But I think having my professor, who was more than a Zionist, who was an armed Zionist, like having me read stuff from different sides of the question, it was almost like no one could ever say that I did this in an unprincipled way. Now I wouldn't give a shit at all how somebody arrived at their politics. But for me at age 20 at the time, it did matter to me on some level that I was getting reading material from all sides.
so of course, you're, as all people are, a multifaceted human being. So I don't want to just stick your episode into sports and nothing else, but I am interested of where sports came into the mix, because I don't think there's a causal rational line, but my very similar Zionist upbringing was tied to, like, I remember a friend of mine's dad would count the Jewish players in the World Series and be like, go for that team because they have more Jewish players. And there was never a therefore Israel, but there was always this like thin connection of
Sure.
sports and Judaism and Zionism were all entangled. And did you find any of that?
Well, let's take a step back for a second. First of all, Jews and the sports I loved, which was primarily at the time basketball and baseball, were absolutely intertwined with one another. And I was a history guy. I was a history major. I was reading history for fun at a very, very young age. I mean, written for children. But I was always more interested in that nonfiction world of what the hell happened and how did we get here. And obviously, as folks can guess from your questions, if they have no idea who I am, sports history was a big deal for me. So learning things about like Harry Baum, the legendary Columbia University graduate who brought the skill set of lacrosse into how to teach basketball in the projects of New York City in like 1910. And he taught one team back then they called project settlements. And in 1910, he was coaching what was known as the Black Settlement, although they didn't use the word black. And they were, under his coaching, were beating everybody. And the Irish teams and the Jewish teams, and the Irish teams would taunt the black athletes by saying, you're only winning because you play that Jew ball, which I think is fascinating that they reached to anti-Semitism to come up with a slur for black players. So I knew that history, like Jew ball was like some of the first free-flowing basketball, and because of this guy, Harry Baum, and other Jewish pioneers, Red Auerbach. And again, you get into the whole issue of black players like Red Auerbach and racist-ass Boston standing up for people like Satch Sanders and, of course, the great Bill Russell. You learn this in Brooklyn's own Red Auerbach. So it's like you feel like this sense of kinship with basketball as a Jew. I did, certainly. Growing up, like I felt like I had a right. I see the politically problematic nature of this, being, a white kid of some privilege in New York City, but I felt like I had the right to do things like go to Left Rat Queens and track down Kenny Anderson and play basketball with Kenny on one of his courts in Left Rat Queens. In a way, I had too much moxie. I had too much a sense of I deserve to be in this space, and some of that really was rooted in my own history as a Jew in the sport. We're a part of this thing, because, raised in New York at that time, it was very much a black sport. But international players were, Arvydas Sabonis, the Olympic, Oscar Schmidt, like they were Olympic and world tournament guys, not people, in the NBA. I mean, Hakeem was, of course, Hakeem Olajuwon, but we didn't think of Hakeem as, in retrospect, as international because he played 3 years at Houston. So we knew him as a college player. I think that does create a little bit of a difference. So that was the Zionism piece. I'll tell you how it connects in an interesting way, at least, is the more I started to learn about Zionism and anti-Zionism, the more, comfortable I became around Arab and Muslim students. My best friend in high school, like I told you, is Iranian, so that's Persian. and his family was more like left-wing political than they were religious. So it was really in college where I like started to like really meet people and become friends with people who were Muslim or who were from more traditional Arab American backgrounds. And growing up in New York, there was no shortage of folks who would meet that description, but I would always feel a sense of distance, like really thinking like, are they anti-Jewish, because I'm here. Not even thinking of it from a Zionist conception, but totally thinking of it, oh, they must be anti-Jewish, which is frankly one of the things that maddens me about the current moment. Because I'm like, okay, when I was fucking 19, I figured it the fuck out that being an Arab or Muslim doesn't mean you're anti-Semitic, and you can have a criticism of Israel without being anti-Semitic. I figured that out as a fucking teenager. And to see the goddamn president of Harvard wave it like a bloody shirt. And I know some of that is for opportunistic reasons, but a lot of these people believe it too. Like the mere fact of being Arab or Muslim is this kind of original sin. So you get a situation where like an American who's Palestinian can be killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank, as happened a couple of months ago, and not a word about it. It's like no one cares. And you just imagine what would have happened if like a Jewish kid from the United States was killed by a Palestinian in the West Bank, and how that the kind of wall-to-wall coverage that would supply the most reprehensible people in our politics. But the fact that it was breaking down in my mind, that my own racism, it was the only thing you can call it, my own prejudice, the fact that it was breaking down meant that my mind was open as a sports fan and as somebody who saw themselves as an anti-racist independently of all of this. When Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf in 1996 makes the decision to not stand for the national anthem, to not come out for the anthem, and how it cost him his career. And I followed that story so closely. And it wasn't until I interviewed Rauf almost 20 years later that I really learned about his motivations for why he did it. And a lot of it was rooted actually in reading people like Chomsky and having an anti-imperialist mindset and thinking about things like the sanctions in Iraq. And we were only still just a couple of years off of the New World Order and Operation Desert Storm and all of that. So that's what was imbuing Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf with his position. For me, at the time, I was watching the media where it was very much pitched into, all right, he has this Islamic faith, and even the people who were kindest were, being a Muslim, maybe it gives you like an outside perspective on Christian nationalists or Judeo-Christian nationalist United States. And sometimes that was said very derisively, like, don't trust these Muslims. But for me, I would hear that and I would be like, wow, that's fascinating. And then that got me really thinking about people like Muhammad Ali, like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and thinking of it in terms of like, okay, a lot of these Muslim athletes are also like standing up to the dominant narratives in this country. And that was part and parcel with the breaking down of my Zionism, really was seeing Arabs and Muslims as three-dimensional human beings whose grievances were just. And so the athletic piece, it didn't push me in that direction because I was already there. But what it did was it amplified in my mind that I didn't just have to be a sports fan. I can maybe even build a career out of talking about the rebel politics in sports.
It's almost the opposite of myself. Becoming an anti-Zionist for me meant that I had to untether myself from Judaism. I didn't think that I could be a Jew. And similarly, in high school, when I started getting politicized, I thought, shit, I can't be a sports fan. Please don't hang up. I'm a hardcore Philly guy. I know you're a New Yorker. Actually going for you guys. Please beat the Celtics on our behalf. I thought I was getting politicized. I was getting into arts. I thought I'm going to be a writer and a leftist. And I thought, therefore, this corporate bullshit can't be something that I'm interested in. So, I missed out. I came of age when Allen Iverson was at his prime and missed some of his prime years. I felt like being a political person meant that I couldn't be a sports person. I saw them as in this irreconcilable tension. But it sounds like for you, there was actually something propelling you, that saying I'm being politicized also meant I'm learning the lessons that people in sports have taught over time? I know you've written about Muhammad Ali in particular.
Very accurate. And I'd be very remiss if I didn't mention a book that really did push me along that path. This is why I really like to lend books to people. One, because I have too many, and if they don't return them, my partner, my wife would be like, good. We're being surrounded by books. We're being drowned by books. But I like lending them to people because even if it only happens once in 50 times, like I've had more instances in my life of actually changing somebody's life, not by arguing with them and not by doing some speech, but just by handing them a book and they read it and they think for themselves about it and it changes their life. And what's given me such confidence in that process is that happened to me. I was lent a book called Muhammad Ali. It was called Redemption Song, Muhammad Ali in the Spirit of the 1960s by Mike Marqusee. And I never could have known this now. I never could have known this at the time. But Mike Marqusee was an anti-Zionist Jew who a good 15 years ago, he died. A good 15 years ago, he wrote an amazing book that nobody bought about and it was ahead of its time. It was about his journey to anti-Zionism. And it was called If I Am Not For Myself. And I can't recommend it enough to people. But that was Mike. He had a very eclectic, beautiful mind. He wrote a brilliant book about Bob Dylan called Wicked Messenger. He wrote a book about cricket. That was amazing. But it was the Ali book. And I got to know Mike later in life, which was an amazing experience. But it was a synthesis of Ali's politics and the 1960s and how that was shaped by a lot of the contradictions that existed at the time in the Nation of Islam. And that's what really also put my mind in a place of a synthesis of all these different ideas. So I don't know, maybe Mike was just giving off an anti-Zionist Jewish vibe that I had no idea existed. I didn't even know he was Jewish. Dude named Mike Marqusee, coming out of England. But there was something about it. Maybe the questioning, the idea of standing firmly on a set of principles while also really asking questions. That's very Jewish to me. And that's very present in that book. So I can't think of one time in my life where I was like, I'm not Jewish. It was always like sort of tattooed with me. And I think also I got to say, I think I benefited a lot from being primarily raised by my non-Zionist mom and not having Zionism tattooed on me the way Judaism was tattooed on me. My dad's Zionism was more of like a wash-off tattoo.
So a lot of this podcast is focused on how you learn it, how you unlearn it, but then really emphasizing the actions you're taking, the making worlds. And your work is bound up in sports writing. And I think, I don't want to pin you into saying like you're a niche or anything like that. I think you're widely read. If you're writing for the nation, people are reading outside of that. But I do wonder how you navigate those worlds. I'm a professor. I'm in a lot of lefty organizing spaces, and I constantly have to explain this thing of, what's that? Oh, yeah, this is okay, this is a picture of this guy named Joel Embiid, and it says the process because there's this thing called the process that we have to trust here in Philly, and it's like a 20-minute conversation that nobody cares about. Or the opposite. Like I haven't been bold enough yet to do it, but there are these really cool hats that have been that are sold throughout the city that have the Phillies logo, and it says free, and then the Phillies P is Palestine. You wear that to Citizens Bank Park, and you're going to get some bare minimum. You're going to get some looks. So I'm wondering how you kind of navigate.
Would it be that bad, honestly?
Ooh, how
bad would it be, do you think? Because I know the reputation of the Philly fans, but
yeah,
are they that wired into being like hell with Palestine?
No. You'd get mixed because something I want to ask you later is also like my partners in environmental justice work, and they were talking about this Stop Cop City event, and they were like, if you get arrested, you say nothing. What do you say? And all of these like wild, queer, fanatical lefties are like, the one thing you say is go Birds, right? So there's this Philly
great
I will see keffiyehs when I go to the stadium. I will see people who are organizing, but also, yeah, it would be pretty bad if the wrong person catches you, because there's some pretty loud right-wing folks in the city. Yeah. I'm just more wondering like how you navigate these different worlds. Of course, you're not the only person who brings together sports and politics, but they often are pushed into separate spaces.
No, that's right. But I mean, first of all, let's be clear that when we talk about pushed into separate places, we're talking about this country, because the pro-Palestine stuff on the international soccer scene is wild. And I'm not just talking about the Middle East and Asia, like Western Europe, red card Palestine, people bringing flags to games, wholesale demonstrations of soccer clubs in the stands, massive protests when Israel does its sports washing thing and sends its teams to tour Europe and the United States. Now, I've been part of demonstrations here. Let's make no mistake. Like when the Maccabi team comes, I've covered them. I've written about them for The Nation. Like when the famed Maccabi basketball team does goodwill tours organized by NBA owners and Adam Silver, like we protest those things, no question, because it's such naked propaganda, sports propaganda. You know, I've worked with athletes on protesting the trips that they take that are deeply, deeply prescribed. Like it's paid for them, all expense paid for their whole family. And let me tell you something, a lot of athletes pinch pennies really hard. There's the bit of the stereotype of the athlete who gets the $80 million contract and blows it all because they're getting houses for all their buddies and cars and all that. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but the greater reality is an athlete's going to pinch that penny like it's nobody's business because they know what poverty tastes like. And they've had the experience of seeing generations of athletes lose all their money. So it's held close to the chest. So for an athlete to be offered like full expense paid trip, your whole family, Israel, tour, food, lodging, a lot of them are like, yeah, what an experience. Because a lot of athletes also some have incredible wanderlust that's so inspiring. Like I could tell you stories about athletes who choose not to even have homes when they retire and just use their money to travel and live different places for several weeks at a time. But a lot of athletes also, like if it wasn't traveling for a team, they've never left the country. So they're going to Israel with their whole family, it paid for, and then they find out when they're there that they actually can't go where they want to go and they can't see what they want to see because it's a state tour and there are people with big smiles taking photos with them who are also carrying big guns and telling them, no, you can't go to that neighborhood. No, you can't go to the old city in Jerusalem. You know, all the things they don't want them to see. It's an apartheid trip. And I've worked with athletes who've backed out of those trips and written public letters and explained why they're not going and talking about solidarity. I mean, I don't think they even do the trips anymore because it was more and more black athletes. It was like, we either do a trip of just white athletes, which looks weird, or we bring black athletes and risk them saying, wait a minute, aren't the police who are crushing the protests in Ferguson, were they trained really by the Israeli police department? Like, and you know, it doesn't take, you know, Edward Said, as you mentioned him earlier, to draw those conclusions about the very natural solidarity that exists. Like, wait a minute, there's a mural to George Floyd on the wall in Gaza. It's like, oh, well, yeah, there is. There's a commonality of oppression, and how when you see that here too. You know, like Angela Davis, her book's title is so good. It's Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and it's about Israel and it's about Palestine and Black America and the connections therein. But yeah, so it was it's that sports experience now these days, I think it runs through Zionism really, really sharply. Now, if you're talking about, though, a British or Irish style thing where you see the anti-Zionism like in the stands, I mean, it'll happen when the Olympics come to LA in 2020. I promise you. It'll happen when the World Cup is here in 2026. But if you are correct, Jordan. If you're talking about people going to a Phillies game, big numbers and flexing their Palestinian bona fides, yeah, that's going to be looked at a little bit, side.
I think I just have a bunch of questions about the tensions that arise, because I also wonder about, for me, it was so exciting to discover your work and similar folks' work, because sports is always political. Everything is political, and it's a site of learning and struggle in so
Mhm.
many ways. And yet, it's also, sometimes I get back from some actions, and then I'm doing some work, and I'm like feeling really engaged, but it's exhausting. And something that helps me keep going is like, can I please just like spend 5 fucking minutes looking at box
Mhm.
scores, watching Steph Curry highlights, and like just escaping. So I'm wondering, particularly because this is not just a lifelong passion, this is your job, how you balance that tension of sports as a site of political education versus sports as a place to just have fun and escape. And maybe it can even
Well,
be both, but
yeah, no, of course it's both. I mean, and it certainly helps that I have a sports mad son. Sometimes I do wonder if my 17-year-old son hadn't, because I have two kids, and my daughter, who's 20, is a total non-sports person, but my son is always been very much a sports person as an athlete, certainly, but also a huge fan and going to games and everything. And so sometimes I do wonder if I didn't have him as a lifeline to how you feel as a kid when you watch sports. I wonder how much my fandom would have fallen away. But it's never fallen away. I've always viewed sports as art, and to throw away sports would be like throwing away art. And I think there's a certain snobbishness when people have the expectation that you throw away sports. Because I've never heard somebody on the left say, no, you can't look at that painting because it was funded by an aristocracy that was utterly oppressive and corrupt. And to respond like, well, those were the only people funding artists. So you have to understand it through that gaze, through that lens. And you understand where a work of art comes from while also appreciating what's so artistic about it. I mean, that's the way I viewed sports for over half my life at this point. Like it's art, it's ballet, and yeah, it may have been created under conditions that are certainly far from ideal. But what the heck do we say about the music industry then? And would you ever say that people shouldn't listen to music? You never would. So, but sports gets that rap, I think, because of its popularity. And so people look at the world, people on the left look at the world, and very understandably, they're like, this is not the world I want to live in at all. And so how does the world change? Well, you read a book and you see, wow, change doesn't happen from just electing the right person, as you guys in Pennsylvania certainly know well based on a certain one of your senators. But you also know that change can only happen through mass struggle, but you're not seeing the mass struggle. So you start to look for reasons why the mass struggle isn't there. And people invariably, I think, turn to what is the most unicultural force that we have now in America, and that's sports. Monocultural, I should say. And that's sports. We don't all gather around the TV to watch LA Law anymore. It's just, there's no real movie that unifies people the way like Star Wars did, or even Titanic. But you have this sports. So people invariably then blame the sports. That's a fetter for why you aren't seeing the kind of mass struggle that can change the world. And I think that's wrong. I think that the reasons why people don't struggle is not because of things that they enjoy, because the things they enjoy, like sports, are really the equivalent of the old Marx opiate of the masses thing. It's like but then you have to ask, why do people reach for opiates in the first place? Because of pain, because of alienation, because of isolation, because of atomization. And sports provides a way out of that, the way recreational drugs do for a lot of people. And given how awful our world is, I am not going to ever decry somebody for needing recreational drugs. And I'm never going to condemn somebody for needing sports, because you also have to survive in this world somehow. Now, that doesn't mean you don't point out all the ways that sports is racist, sexist, homophobic, certainly transphobic, as well as an absolute motor of corporatism and hyper-capitalism. But one of the things that I love doing and why I still haven't gotten bored with my job after all these years is that you can tease out all of those things and use it as a way to reach people who aren't political. Like, yo, this is racist. And why should our football team in Washington, D.C. have a racist name? Shouldn't we root for a team that doesn't have that isn't a racial slur? And, when that fight was going on, I did a lot of panels in a lot of black churches in D.C. Only white guy on the panel, I'll tell you that. I wouldn't do it if it was like the white saviors come to explain this. Partly because the audiences were always very split. But it was the splits that I found so fascinating because there is this connection with sports and with that name, we'll just call it the R word for these purposes, where people would show up to these debates in a church dressed in regalia from head to toe. And they're just like, this is ours, and you're not going to take it away. While other people in the church and us would be like, well, actually, it's not yours. It was George Preston Marshall's, and he was a pro-Dixie owner. So maybe we need to put this history in the dustbin and come up with something new. So there's a power to sports also to reach people politically as well. So I guess if I just gave a three-pronged answer to that, it's, you can reach people politically through sports. Sports is an art, and we all need drugs sometimes.
On all accounts. Yeah, and I always say, I definitely hear the opiate of the masses. I always say to people, also, people do more than one thing. And if you're saying this is the opiate of the masses and you get 65,000 working class people all together and they're talking for 3 hours, you start talking about some other shit too. I do wonder about for you personally. Like for me, I want to just sit down sometimes and just watch the Eagles. But now I'm thinking, Jesus Christ, Saquon, what were you thinking?
But you
can
can
be
think both.
escapist. Yeah.
You can think both. I mean, I know it makes it harder. I'm not saying it doesn't at all. But I think that's where particularly someone like yourself who does public facing work can actually then write about that to reach people who are similarly frustrated and upset and try to explain it a little bit. And also, lean in a little bit to the Jalen Hurtses and the Brandon Grahams.
Yeah.
And talk about how, these things are highly contradictory. And, if I ever have the chance to be caught in an elevator with Saquon Barkley, you better believe me, he's going to hear about this shit. Yeah. And also let's also, I want to say to you, Jordan, that these things are also in the age of social media, we're not just helpless. Like Saquon Barkley had to respond to people's anger because so much anger was expressed at him online. And his excuse was so whack-ass that it sparked a whole nother round of commentary. We did a whole section on my radio. I do a radio show in D.C. on WPFW. My co-host is former NBA player Etan Thomas. We did so there's some credibility there. Played 10 years in the NBA. We did a whole freaking half hour of the show on why Saquon Barkley really, really, really did fuck up. And so we would not have had the content to discuss that if it was just him at the White House having a visit. But it was because of the follow-up tweet and the follow-up explanation, which was so whack as shit. And he does not give the follow-up explanation without people online being like, dude, what are you doing? So I think there's something empowering in that, quite frankly. I mean, I remember when Marge Schott, this shows how freaking old I am. I remember when Marge Schott, the owner of the Cincinnati Reds, revealed very happily to Sports Illustrated that she was a Nazi memorabilia collector. And everybody was shocked and appalled. But the people who were shocked and appalled were like the 25 powerful sports columnists in the United States. And all we got to do is sort of bask in the light of them being appalled. We couldn't have millions of people, getting in touch with the Reds organization over various social media apps being like, she got to sell this team. And she actually was pressured to sell the team, although I actually think it had much more with her happily calling Eric Davis the N-word and things like that. Like it became accumulatively too much, like her racist ass presence. But man, people also didn't have the chance to express their anti-racist, anti-Nazi outrage in a way that we do today. Now, I'm not comparing Saquon Barkley to a Nazi. Let's not get it twisted. But is he being a normalizer of a proto-fascist administration? I think he is. And I think that's an objective fact at this point. I'm also okay with being like, yo, I hope this dude finds his way. He's still a very young man. He's lived a very cloistered environment. He's clearly extremely bright. And right now he is in the thrall of a Nazi, and he's going to hear about it from us, or whatever phrase you want to use. I don't want to open that can of worms, but certainly someone who has built an administration of Nazi hobbyists and enthusiasts.
A safe haven for sure.
The worst people in our society, yes.
I think that's a great point of that, people should always be held to account, but that education suggests that this is ongoing, never ending. Maybe, we'll be celebrating in the White House in 2026 when Saquon is actively boycotting all that. And I think the thing that I'm wondering, I reached out to you and wanted you to be a guest from a very simple episode you did. You recently did an episode on what ifs, which is one of my favorite things of all time, particularly being a diehard Sixers fan, having lived through the process, which is constantly what if Markelle Fultz's shoulder was fine? What if Ben Simmons ever learned to shoot? What if Zaire Smith didn't have a sesame allergy? Like, we can play on and on and on and on. There's always this like, what if this had happened? What if Markelle Fultz had actually just developed into the player that he started to be? And that feeling of what if, it's always fun for me as a sports fan, but it also, when I was listening to your episode, I thought, this is exactly the idea of radical education, of this. It's this everyday practice of imagining other worlds just happening through sports. And I can't tell you, I'm sure everybody who has a vague interest in sports or something related to that has done this kind of imagining. And I wonder if you see sports as having that potential of like this kind of everyday practices of imagining the possibilities of thinking towards other worlds.
Definitely. I did talks a few years ago. They were mistimed, but I'm proud of myself for the effort. Right. Whenever I was asked to do a talk at a school or something, I said, okay, but what I'm going to talk about is something I'm calling sports futurism. And it's going to be a talk about what sports could look like in a better society, not ravaged by the horribleness of our current one. And I love doing those talks, and they were fun. I think now, looking back, given the political moment that we are in, let me just say I did a talk at Harvard last week, and it was not a talk about sports futurism. It was about your school better get its back straight in the face of this shit, because, we're either going to be fucking anti-fascist or we're going to be a fucking stain on the ground. And now let's talk about how sports athletes have been part of anti-fascist movements over the last 100 years. That's been more my talk, instead of let's talk about how good things could be. And, there is a role for that, how good things can be, because you got to give people something to fight for. Dr. King even said you have to give the people victories. And in my mind, it was like, even if it's a mental victory of, wow, we can imagine something different, that there's value in that. I just don't think it's the most urgent thing right now. So I'm happier with where my lane currently is right now, using sports, as you said, for the purposes of education. I also think that in terms of online culture, there's a great value in terms of modeling how you argue. Now, I'm not the biggest AOC fan for reasons I could give and don't need to go into. But one thing she says that I like, and I know it's a big cliche, is she always says, like, rather than calling people out, I want to call them in. So there's a way, because I am against call out culture, as I think any principled leftist who understands that minds change and ideas change should be against call out and cancel culture. But the way that So with Saquon, it's not about convincing Saquon. It's about showing everybody else who's outraged how to actually try to win somebody. So it's like, it might only be a few hundred characters, but to be like, hey, Saquon, I really disagree with what you did, particularly considering what Trump is doing right now with regards to the El Salvadoran prisons. This article right here is really key for you to read to understand the underlying dynamics of what they're doing. He's not going to read that. Or maybe there's a 1 in 1,000 chance or million chance he'll read it, but someone else will. And other people might be influenced by how you're even approaching the argument instead of just being like, you fucking sellout, you Trump ass sellout. Because then that also doesn't give Saquon any room to come back from that. A lot of times when people are cornered, as I'm sure you know, they double and triple down instead of really engage with what's being said. And frankly, while I was really glad he felt forced to respond, to me, his responses definitely had the tone of somebody doubling or tripling down instead of being like, whoa, I hear what y'all say. Let me look into this. But that's fine, too, for a lot of people. And I know this is true for me, like a lot of people on their road to getting to a better place. There it does involve a doubling and tripling down, like how dare you call me this and that, Oh my God, I have some stories about that too, of being so fucking defensive and self-righteous about things that were wretched until I actually went back to my dorm room or wherever and actually sat in my thinking chair and calmed down a little bit. When you're talking about not just the intersection of sports and politics, but questions about like, is Bryce Harper the person who's going to lead the Phillies to a World Series, and how you talk about that also models a certain way of arguing as well. And it's like there's a way to do it in a way that's more humanist, more open, less savory. And I'll tell you this, if I rooted for a baseball team that had Venezuelan players on it, and Venezuelans currently make up the third highest number after USA and Dominica, it's 70, I believe, is the number of Venezuelan players. If I rooted for a team with Venezuelan players, I would also be somebody who's like being very loud about the fact, like, what's the team doing to protect this person when they go through airports? What's the union doing to protect this person? I even wrote about that as part of an article about why the hell are the Dodgers visiting the White House, given, and then also like raising up one of their Venezuelan players who stayed home with a great background where he said, I'm not in the White House, I'm in the Brown House. And it was a picture of him in front of his house with kissing his daughter on the cheek.
I think the vast majority of our listeners are going to have zero interest in what I'm about to ask. But for anybody who's sharing a micro interest in sports, hopefully we avoided the two in-group talking elements of this.
I think it's the opposite. I mean,
hopefully we invite folks in, but
I think
for anybody who's interested, the last thing I want to ask, we're in the middle of the NBA playoffs. You're a New York Knicks fan. Who's coming out of the second round, and who do you got in the finals?
I mean, I come at you with a lot of humility here because a lot of humility because before the playoffs, I felt really, really good in the West about picking the Clippers. Like, do I know nothing? Is past not prologue? Do I no longer believe that? And I guess I'm of the belief that at some point the cement hardens. So right now, I've never believed in the Thunder. Out of the West, I like the Minnesota Timberwolves. Big fan, Anthony Edwards, love it all around. And in the East, I just, I've got a lot of depression right now.
Don't say it.
Oh, I'm not going to say it. My least favorite team is the Celtics on earth. My second, in any sport, my second least favorite team on earth in any sport is the Indiana Pacers. So, and you really do have to be just like me to pick the Knicks, which I did before the season, which, it's just, wish casting. Karl Anthony Towns, by the way, is another one who I'm concerned about. Has the cement hardened? Or can this guy, frankly, hit his potential and be like a 30-point, 12-rebound guy in the playoffs? Like, I feel like that can still happen. but he's dangerously close to having the cement hardened to me, because he has played in a lot of these games at this point, and it's always disappointing. So yeah, so let's go Knicks out of the East. Knicks T-Wolves.
Well, I look forward to watching. There'd be they've been kind of shared history throughout the season with the trade and everything. So I look forward to a Timberwolves Knicks finals while doing Palestine solidarity work.
Let's say this loudly and proudly. These issues are not counterposed.
Yeah.
And if you don't believe that, you should see some of the text chains I'm on with some of my Palestinian sisters and brothers. Let's be honest, it's more brothers than sisters. I'm not going to try to make it sound like it's some kumbaya. But my Palestinian friends, man, they are NBA junkies.
Today's episode was produced by Yardain Imran, Samantha Haley, and me. Music by Yardain. If you like our podcast, please subscribe and rate us wherever you listen. You can also follow us on Instagram, where another ed is possible. As we mention so often, please show up, give support. This week marks Nakba 77. We're going to be sharing extra resources, mutual aid campaigns. A lot of stuff is going to be appearing on our Instagram. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.